evening. Namaskar. I welcome you all to yet another event in the series IHC Conversation with Authors, presented by the Habitat Library and Resource Center. I welcome our three distinguished guests, author Rami Chhabra, and she'll be in conversation with Kishwar Desai, and our President India Habitat Center, Ambassador Bhaswati Mukherjee. She's going to chair this session. So thank you. Thank you all for coming. Thank you, our guests. The book which is going to be discussed this evening is Becoming the Storm by Rami Chhabra. It's an honor to have you here, ma'am, with us. Thank you very much for making this possible. Yes. You are an inspiration to all of us here. Thank you very much. Before I move ahead, I'll just a brief introduction about the author. Rami Chhabra is a well-known media personality and social activist. Her life work over a half century represents sustained commitment to women and social development issues. She has addressed these through a rare multifaceted career as media person, NGO professional, Government of India administrator, international consultant, and social activist. Pioneer women journalist in both print and electronic media, she was amongst the handful of women who post-independence broke into the all-male bastions of the newspaper world. Additionally, she was interviewed on the television since its inception in the country in 1965. Writing prolifically as an independent freelance journalist, she soon carved column space in several leading newspapers, the Hindustan Times, the Statesman, and the Indian Express. Her critiques of the mishandling of the family planning program post-emergency and the media neglect of this silent emergency were to be a life game changer. It led to roles beyond media, first to spearhead work to depoliticize and re-energize the family planning efforts across the country with a leading NGO, Family Planning Foundation, then to a challenging assignment within government as Prime Minister Rajiv Gandhi appointed her advisor and additional secretary, Ministry of Health and Family Welfare, to oversee communication in the year between 1986 to 89. Rami Chhabra's expertise in public service communication, population, women's development has been called upon by the Indian government, other developing countries, national and international NGOs, and international agencies. Widely traveled, Rami Chhabra has been invited to speak at innumerable seminar conferences within India and abroad. Thank you very much, ma'am. She's going to be in conversation with Kishwar Desai. Kishwar Desai has been awarded and recognized for her work in art, history, and literature, both in the UK and India. She's an award-winning author, playwright, historian. As an author, her sixth book, The Longest Kiss, The Life and Times of Devika Rani, recently received an award from the President of India for the best book on Indian cinema at the National Film Awards. And not just that, and the book is being now made into a feature film by a leading studio. Her debut novel, Witness the Night, won the Costa Award for the best first novel in the UK and Ireland. Following that, she wrote a trilogy featuring Simran Singh, a social worker turned detective. Witness the Night is also under discussion for a feature film as her first book, non-fiction book on Indian cinema, Darling Ji. She is the chair of the Arts and Cultural Heritage Trust that set up the world's first partition museum at the historic Town Hall, Amritsar, and won 7 awards. The trust has now set up the second partition museum at the Dara Shikoh Library in Old Delhi. And these are people's museums crafted entirely through donations and contain documents, memorabilia, and material from the partition of India in 1947, which impacted more than 20 million in the world's largest migration. For the past 10 years, she has been working on various aspects of colonial history and examining areas which have and impact both in the UK and India. She is at present working on a historic biography set in the UK and India. Thank you very much for being here today. This evening, the session will be chaired by President of India Habitat Center, Ambassador Bhaswati Mukherjee. Ambassador Bhaswati Mukherjee is a seasoned Indian diplomat with a distinguished career in foreign service. She has served as India's permanent representative to UNESCO in Paris and held numerous senior diplomatic positions. Ambassador Mukherjee is known for her expertise in multilateral diplomacy, global governance, and cultural heritage preservation. In addition to her diplomatic work, she has authored insightful writings on India's foreign policy and international relations. She is widely respected for her contribution to India's role on the global stage, particularly in areas related to education, culture, and international cooperation. Thank you very much, Madam, for agreeing to chair this session. I now welcome our distinguished guest onto the dais, the author. Yes. So, ladies and gentlemen, please welcome the author Rami Chhabra, Kishwar Desai, and President India Habitat Center, Ambassador Bhaswati Mukherjee, who's going to chair this session. I will now request Ambassador Mukherjee for her opening remarks. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Shadab. And welcome all of you. Welcome our author and our equally distinguished discussant. It's an all-female podium, which fills me with joy since I'm a feminist. I'm very proud of being a feminist. I wanted to begin by saying that I first met Ms. Rami Chhabra at the 3rd UN Conference for Women in Nairobi, Kenya, in July 1985. I was a very junior undersecretary in the United Nations Division, and Prime Minister Rajiv Gandhi decided that the official delegation has to be all female. So since the Foreign Service is very male, they found it very difficult to find all females. So ultimately, they picked on me, the very junior Undersecretary UN Division, and I was sent off to Nairobi, where I had a very great interaction with Rami Chhabra, and I actually was the roommate of Smita Patil. So I've never forgotten my experience in Nairobi, and I've never forgotten my meeting with her. She's also an alumni of Miranda House, which is my college, and it's always a pleasure to meet alumni from Miranda House, because I truly believe that Miranda House, just post-partition, actually led the women's liberation movement. And many of us are proud of our college and what it's done for liberating women from, unfortunately, a rather patriarchal conservative society. This book, which has been written by the author at the age of 86, is itself a rare achievement. Please give her a hand. The novel, which I've gone through, reflects her deep understanding of gender struggles in India post-partition, and her experience when she was leading the NGO called Stree Bal, which is, again, a great word for a woman's NGO, which fought against early marriages and dowry. You can see how it's influenced her novel writing. Becoming the Storm is a very conscious feminist statement. It's not combative, it's compassionate. The book itself is compassionate. The heroine of the book, Indu, reminds me so much of the struggles of the women older to me, living in Delhi, in post-partition Delhi, at a time when Khan Market was coming up, when people used to talk of Khushwant Singh and Sujan Singh Park and Ambassador Hotel. That was the Delhi of our days. There was no pollution, there was no traffic. It was a completely different city. It was a very civilized city, but it was a city which was deeply rooted in conservative values, which the story of our heroine unfolds. What is particularly interesting about this book, and I hope you'll all buy a copy, it's outside, is that it mirrors today's transitions, economic upheavals, cultural shifts, and migration of ideas. I was ambassador of India to Netherlands when Nirbhaya happened. When Nirbhaya happened, I woke up the next morning and the security guard told me कि मैडम ये तो 15 अगस्त 26 जनवरी नहीं है, पर बहुत लोगों ने गेट में बहुत सारे गुलाब और फूल आपके लिए छोड़ के गए. So I went there and I found a huge group of Dutch saying, we came to congratulate you because you're an Indian woman and you become an ambassador, you're alive. So I called up the foreign minister, who was also my classmate, Salman Khurshid Bhai, and I told him that I'd like your permission to go live on Dutch TV to explain that Delhi is not the rape capital of the world, that all Indian men are not born with rape in their minds, and that there is a lot of rape in Europe, including in Netherlands, which is all brushed under the carpet. So he said, well, I'm sure you can handle it. Be a little careful though. I said, yes. It was such a huge success, and I opened a visitor's book in the embassy, where at lunchtime the Dutch would come and talk to me for 1 hour about women in India, about my life story, etc. So much so that he then instructed my peer group, ambassadors in London and France and Germany, to do the same, and they all called me up and said, yaar, tera time phaltu hai. Why are you creating extra work for us? So I said, I never asked him to call you people. I did it spontaneously as a woman ambassador. But it had a great impact because Netherlands was the only country during that time when the whole world was talking about the condition of women in India. Netherlands was the only country that did not do so. I would also like to say that for us Indian women, the journey continues and the struggle continues. But what is very important to understand is that now there is much greater support for women from Indian men, which was not there so earlier. It was not there when I joined Foreign Service in 1976 at the age of 21 and a half. It was not there when I traveled with my mother's black trunk and an old hand baggage which she had got for her marriage and $20 US and reached Paris on my first posting without knowing a word of French. There was no mobile phone, there was no computer, there was no way of communicating. But I told myself, I brought this on myself. I wanted to liberate myself. Now I can't turn and run. I have nowhere to run. I better just make it. And I made it. And lots of women made it. So that's what the book is all about. I'd like to conclude by saying that one of my favorite messages whenever I felt down in my career of emancipating myself and becoming a highly successful woman was the message from Germaine Greer, whom I greatly admire, one of the founding mothers of the women's movement. She said, one may not reach the dawn save by the path of the night. And she added, freedom is fragile and must be protected. To sacrifice it, even as a temporary measure, is to betray it. And I say that when I go to mentor my young women colleagues in the Foreign Service, I said, don't ask for freebies, don't ask for excuses, don't ask for flexi timing. They say, but ma'am, it's given to the men. I said, it is given to the men. But you guys will not ask it because we are the stronger sex. We have to be super women, super housekeepers, super cooks, super dish cleaners, super officers, super ambassadors. You guys will do it because you're strong and you'll do it. I did it, you'll do it. And that's what this book is all about. Finally, I'd like to thank the author who gifted me the book and wrote the most touching citation on the book, which I'll read out. She says, for Bhaswati, who epitomizes the perfect storm. And I'd like to thank her for that and to say that she too and all three of us epitomize the perfect storm. Thank you very much.
Okay.
The discussion will now commence, and I'm seated at the side because I don't want to be kebab mein haddi. Over to you.
So shall I start? Okay. Yeah. I just want to thank the ambassador for that wonderful introduction, and also to remind us all that this is a very, very crucial day for India and indeed for Delhi that we are conducting this discussion on. We have just got Delhi's woman chief minister, which is, of course, not, we had one in the past as well, but it needed to be done again for us to reassert the fact that, as you said, women can create the perfect storm, but they can also create the perfect city, which is what we are hoping for. So on that note, let me begin by asking Rami ji. You know, she's an old friend of my mother's. Actually, I shouldn't use the word old, because she is not old. I mean, you can see that she is young in every way. I know as an author how difficult it is to write a book, and the long hours of struggle, the long hours that you have to slave over your desk. And did you handwrite it, or did you write it on the computer? Computer. So it takes long, long hours to do that, laptop. And so for her to do it at the age of 85 or 86 is really, 84 is when you began the book? 82. Is remarkable, because I think just to be such an inspirational, iconic person for all of us is a great thing. So I think we should give a special round of applause for that. And so my first question to her really is, what inspired you to write this book? Why did you feel this book was necessary, especially now?
Thank you, Kishwar. But before I start, I want to thank Bhaswati for the lovely words that you used in describing my book and my life. And I want to say that I am privileged that I have two perfect storms on either side of me.
Thank you.
Yes. These are, as Bhaswati very rightly said, women have come a long way. And while I have described a period in the 50s and the 60s and Delhi that was then, things are hopefully different for a lot of people, but also not for so many, which is one of the points why I wrote the book. So I'll come back to that and say, I think I've been wanting to write a book for the longest years. I did a memoir of my professional life, Breaking Ground, Journey into the Media and Out. And I'm very glad that my editor from National Book Trust is here with me at the moment. And I ended this book in the last page saying, you know, I was in a very disillusioned phase of life in 2012 when they brought out that book. And I have to really use this opportunity to thank my editor and thank the chairman of the National Book Trust, Bipin Chandra, who's then, who said, write what you feel like writing. This is a free country. And the last half of my book is very, very critical of the powers that were there at that time. So it was a disillusioned phase of my life when I felt I was being totally marginalized for fighting a battle. I will go into that in a later phase when we talk. And I said, this is it, time to retreat, build a house in the mountains, and perhaps write a book of fiction, because life itself has become worse than fiction right now. That's the final word here. But then it took a long time because we, as Bhaswati said, were women of a time when we thought we were superwomen. We wanted to be good wives, we wanted to be good mothers, we wanted to be good citizens, and we wanted to be good workers. And so that was a phase of my life when my husband was seriously ill, and I put away other things to tide over that period. So several years went by, and then it was COVID, when finally, strangely enough, a time when the world was in turmoil, I found the tranquility to sit down, not disturbed by anything else, and look back. And also because of what was happening around us then, the world was changing. changing so fast. So it was not just simply my disillusionment, but there was a much larger disillusionment around the world. And I thought, one had been privileged to live at a time when there was tremendous idealism. And we were growing up in that. And I wanted to recall the nostalgia of that time and recall also the kind of camaraderie that existed. You know, Kishwar, you would vouch for that, whether my book is authentic or not. But the Punjabiyat of Delhi at the time when, after the partition, people had lost a lot, and yet they were getting together. There were families fighting, but also loving. You know, all the passions and all the, you know, the goodwill and the innuendos, everything was there, but the family was a family. It's something that we've lost. So I wanted to look back at that time, and while looking back at that time, I also wanted to bring in issues that I faced then from memories, but also because over a long life, now I was 82, and I've been the founder president of Stribal, and I'm very privileged as some of my partners from Stribal are here too today, an organization that we run in Stribal in Saptajaga Enclave for 51 years and fought some national battles. And early marriage, dowry problems, domestic violence, I felt these were issues that were still very relevant, but were going into the background. And so I wove them in. Long answer, but I'll finally end that by saying that I felt a bit like Penelope in the Dhaka times, no?
Yes.
Who sat weaving. And in fact, the first name of this book was Karmic Weaves, but my publishers didn't want that. But I thought I was sitting there in the COVID times weaving a tapestry.
Okay.
And that's how it came about.
Right. So I think what anybody who's read the book would be very curious about so many, as you said, so many different strands that you have very skillfully brought together. And I think for us, that is a very important thing, because Indu is the heroine of the book, but there is also her mother's story, there's also her father's story, there is also the story of Ashok, her husband, and then her sisters-in-law, her mother-in-law. It is like a proper family saga that you read and you understand what are the motivations of all these people. As you said, this is a nostalgic look, but also a very realistic look at the past with all its difficulties that our parents faced, our grandparents faced, in a little bit set in pre-partition, but mostly set in post-partition Delhi. So these stories, you said, you accumulated over the years with your work in Istribal, but you would have also observed it in the society that you moved in at that time, that these were very often things that people did not talk about, all the stresses and strains that they were facing, and especially if women wanted to emancipate themselves, which is what we were earlier discussing, how difficult it was when they were bound down by the laws that the family and their husbands sometimes imposed upon them. I think this is not just the story of what you observed in Istribal, but also what you would have seen in the middle class at that time.
Yeah.
Would you like to comment?
Yes. Definitely. I mean, as I said, one part of it is the nostalgia and the idealism, and the difficulty of finding new pathways against that backdrop. But the other part is also of the constraints and the problems that plagued many middle-class lives, no doubt of it, no doubt of that.
Would you like to sort of explain like what Indu was facing in your book, some of the problems she faced?
Before I do that, I thought, the lead motive of this book, if you ask me to pick out one point, is a kind of plea that there should not be early marriage. Mm-hmm. Because that's something that I've been deeply involved with. And I felt, I've written policy papers In fact, I think one of the first papers, much statistics, much analysis, to the Planning Commission, to the PMO, to the rest, on the age of marriage was from me, because I looked at the demographic scenario and pointed out that all this push for contraception that was going on, please look at the age of marriage. You're not figuring in the consequences of the natal issue. In fact, I've spent a lot of time and effort in trying to persuade that we should have what China did, later marriages, then fewer children, and healthier mothers and children. So one of the major ideas in my mind was, one hasn't gone far. I mean, the first paper was 1978. And you have a scenario today where 1/5 of women in the 20 to 24 age group have been married under 18. So, I mean, 75 years down the road, we are improving, but so slowly that it's terrible. So can I come to the issue in another genre?
Okay.
And so I'd like to read you a little bit, which I think, the other challenge was, it is my first novel, and I wondered whether I could do fiction. And
You've done it very well.
Thank you.
Yeah.
But so I had to figure out, could I get some literary device going that would help me not to moralize and not to be didactic, but somehow build interest. And so I think you asked me when the book launched, did I believe in
Yes,
sons?
I was just going to come to that question, yes.
So I said, I don't believe in sons, but here he is, larger than life, and I want to read out this portion to you. This is Indu, who's a young girl studying in college, but with her mother wanting her to get married. She's hardly 16, and there are boys being shown. And there are also problems in Indu's house. The parents have difficulties, and the father is an engineer, renowned, but having problems in his office. And she comes home from college one day to find great excitement because there is a famous sant that is visiting their home. And she's very upset because she doesn't want any of this and says, please, for God's sake, don't ask about my marriage, whatever else you do. And I'm not going to be around. But as it happens, when the sant arrived, and I have this description of him, the next morning when the sant arrived at their house, driven there in his long, sleek, black Chevrolet, the gift a year earlier from a Canadian Sikh disciple, the arrival of which in India, with its 250% customs duty paid, had shot the Bhajavila sant into larger-than-life fame. And at the precise moment that he disembarked from it, resplendent in a long ochre choga with a scarlet cummerbund and maroon turban, looking like a figure stepping out of a Ranjit Singh era painting, Shanti and Ranu were not waiting at the portico to greet him as they normally would have done, and he certainly expected. And so I talk about how they rushed in to get a dakshina going, and it's Indu who realizes that there is a catastrophe because nobody's there to greet him, and she rushes forward. And the sant is a little surprised. The sant smiled benignly, but was somewhat bewildered at being received by just this young girl. And in the process, he absent-mindedly dropped a pen he was slipping into his pocket. Indu saw the pen fall to the ground and instantly dived to pick it up to hand it to him. The sant, assuming that the girl was bending to touch his feet, raised both his hands in blessing, saying to her, "My blessings, Beti, you will make a mark in life. Only I have to tell you this. There are two karmic turning points ahead of you in life. One soon, the other much later. Don't marry at 18. Whatever you do, that relationship is fraught with karmic dukh. No matter how hard you work at it, it is the karmic destiny, karmic sorrow. Marry at 22. And your karma will be entirely different. A smooth life, always. Remember my words. Indu listened with amusement. He hadn't realized that she had been to retrieve his pen, not to touch his feet. And now he's telling her about her karmic destiny. And meanwhile, Shanti and Rano come out. And then, I just want to read you a couple more of what the son says, because this revolves into the story. He's now fated, and Indu's gone inside, and he's done whatever he had to do, look at some problem that he had, which he came to discuss. He had come to discuss his problem, not to give any blessings here. And then you have one of Indu's aunts wanting to ask him something. And he says, Bibi, the son said meaningfully, as he raised his eyes to look at her squarely in the face, and then shook his head with a strange look crossing his face. Vade kar, par chote kam. Bibi, ek mein vich do talwara nahi chaldiyan. Bibi, illustrious families and small actions don't go together. One's cupboard cannot sheathe two swords. Amu blushed scarlet and quickly moved away, now lacking courage to ask anything more. But Rano ventured, Sanchi, may I ask you something? Yes, Bibi, he responded easily. Puchandi lod nahi. You don't have to ask. I know you are mainly worried about your house and the loan from your family on your head. Some of your present worries will sort themselves out, but some won't. The loan will be resolved, but I do not see happiness when and how it happens. What do you mean, Sanji? Rano cried out in alarm. Rano is Indu's mother. Singh Sahib's health? No, our good engineer is frail, and frail he will remain, but he has the blessings of your good care. Bibi, even if the wounds also come from the same hands, they alone are his healer. There was a moment of stunned silence as he looked at her with a piercing gaze, making Rano lower her own eyes. Then he went on, and it goes on. Yeah, right. But some of these predictions then begin to come true.
So, I just want to point out how cleverly you have used your knowledge of statistics to fall out so easily through the lips of a sant, so that, it also helps the ordinary reader to somehow acknowledge that getting married at 18 is not a good thing, and you have managed to give it this kind of cosmic karma, which you said is a very clever literary device, and therefore readers would take it in the flow that it is meant to be, because it is part of the narrative, but that was based on your research that women should not marry at 18. So I think it's a very clever thing to do, and a lot of novelists do use this, that they weave in statistics, knowledge of other areas which they might be working in. So to get the Bajewala Sant to talk about it in such a visual way stays with you. And then, like you said, later on in the book, we can't reveal everything, but he appears in a mystical fashion and helps Indu to take a very, very positive decision, the protagonist, what she has to do next in life. Now, so these are difficult things to weave into a narrative, and I've also tried to do the same in my social thrillers, as they were called, where you talk about issues of gender, but you want to present them in a way that people who are reading a novel will just take it in the flow, the information stays with them, so that's very important. So this was one of the challenges, I think, that you were facing when you were writing this book. So can we just move a little bit, because we'll come back to the rest of the narrative, but I think very interesting point about the craft of this novel. And how did you actually write it? Like I was asking you earlier, did you use your laptop? Did you have a lot of novelists write according to a plan. Since you are very used to bureaucracy, did you sit down and make a huge plan how the novel will go? How did you write?
No, I wanted to write a novel. I wanted to write about the past, and I wanted to weave in some of the issues that I believed in. And I thought I had a very dramatic end, not the end that is here, but a different end and much later in the years. And I had that fixed in my mind, and I was going to move to it. And so I just wrote. I sat on that computer, and since it was COVID time, there was no disturbance anywhere.
So it just came to you,
Yes,
page after
and
page.
I would just sit morning, noon, night, depending when I felt like it. My daughter had COVID. I escaped it. But we had problems in the house too. But it was a time when the outside world was not pressuring, which is what my life has always been, a bit frenetic, I think, otherwise. And so I wrote on the computer, and then I found maybe I wrote too much. In fact, this is thanks to my editor who's here now, Len, somewhere. It's much crisper version of what I eventually put together, that I wasn't able to get to the dramatic end that had got me going for the book. It just wouldn't move.
Okay.
But then the sun came to my rescue.
The cosmic karma that you talk about, but that also gives us hope for a sequel. That dramatic end might just come when you write the part two.
I thought I'd
Of
leave
the
it
storm.
on a cliffhanger. And if there's enough of a response,
Yeah.
yes, there is a dramatic end right at the end, waiting still.
Waiting still. So, what is also very interesting in this book is what you mentioned earlier, the Punjabiyat. I love it because there are dialogues that just pop up in Punjabi, and that for me as a Punjabi is lovely because, it just comes out so naturally in the words of the people who are speaking at that time. So how easy was that for you to put that into the narrative?
No, Punjabi comes naturally to me as a Punjabi, and I love. But I thought this was again something that I wanted to do. I just thought that we had to have the local language, even if people understood it or not. Because at one point, this is where we had a long conversation, the editor and I.
Because editors don't really like this.
The conventional way is to put it either in italics and then, a dash and an explanation. And I said, look, I just wanted to weave it in and out. It's again, the weave was something that was in my mind, whether it was the title, whether it was the work. I said, we weave the conversation. So if you notice, not many books do it like that.
Yeah.
But here we just flow from one to the other. And sometimes we leave the Punjabi and then I explain it in the following paragraph or the following line.
No, that's again a very good device. Very good device. So you had also mentioned that, the feminism, when we were earlier discussing, your own feminism or view of it has changed over the years. Can we see it somewhat reflected in this book? Can you explain what you mean by that, firstly? And secondly, how is it reflected in this book?
Okay, in many ways, this book is a reflection in its entirety of my returning to some basic issues. I don't want to sound immodest, but the point is, I did write the first feminist columns in the country, with Feminist Viewpoint in Indian Express came about just because, I had an editor who believed in me, and I had come back triumphant from that journey into Vietnam straight after the fall of Saigon. And Indian Express had run these travelogues of mine from Hanoi to Ho Chi Minh City, 2,000 kilometers over roads that were not there, and bridges that were not there, for 3 weeks running every Sunday. And so when he said to me, Malgonkar, the editor of editors, who had always picked me up and given me a column, whichever newspaper he was in, he came back after the emergency to Indian Express and said, Mrs. Chhabra, what about your column? And I said, Mr. Malgonkar, no longer what you want to write. I've written enough of what you wanted me to say. Now I want to write about what I believe in. And so he said, what? And I said, a feminist viewpoint. And that's how that column came into being. I don't mind telling you, sharing, going away from the book, but before that I had gone to, Vietnam arose because I went to Mexico City. I attended the first International Women's Year column as a UN fellow. And the Vietnam trip came because I had that ticket in my hand which showed you could go around the world, and I wrangled my way in. But when I went to Mexico City, and I got the invitation, and I talked to the editor of The Statesman, who was a good friend also, because by now I was married to a man who was in a senior position in The Statesman, and so I knew all these people quite well. But when I went to him and I said, I'm going to Mexico City and I'd like to send you a dispatch. And he said, but you know, we have no foreign exchange to cover it. And I said, but this is the first International Women's Conference. And he said, Women's Conference? UN Conference on women? How is that? And finally I had to say to him, look, I have a per diem, and I will pay for the telex messages. You don't have to give me anything. You reimburse me when I come back. And he said, well, then don't, flood us. One when you get there, and one at the end of the conference. It was a 3-week conference. I eventually ended up sending a daily dispatch because it was a very political conference, apart from being the first women's conference. And the world's leaders were there. And the only dispatch that did not get printed was on the day after the emergency, when I wrote saying Indira Gandhi's image stands tarnished in this August gathering. And the delegation in Mexico City called a meeting and said, don't talk to Rami Chhabra, she's unreliable. and the editor here tore my thing as it came off the telex, because already they had these blank pages coming out. So, the coverage of Mexico City conference also took place, because I spent my per diem in doing it. And I share this because this is the kind of situation that the whole women's issues were in at the point when we thought that women's issues are as political as any politics can be.
Right. And have you reflected that in the book?
And so we came into it with survival issues.
Yes.
This was also the time in 1975 when Towards Equality, that famous iconic report on women's situation, had come. And the most startling figure in that was the declining sex ratio, which everybody knows now. But it hit us then that women in this country, that report was being written because Indira Gandhi had planned to carry it to Mexico City and present it as testimony of how India was leading the world with our constitutional principles of gender equality having been woven into the Constitution of India. And instead came this very devastating report, which went underground.
Yes.
And then people like me wrote about it, saying, is it a CBI report that you don't want to bring it? And I scooped it. And because I scooped it and it came out in the newspapers, the report had to be tabled in Parliament.
Right.
And so what I'm saying is that those were the days when we were looking at women's issues, the declining sex ratio, women getting decimated, female feticide still occurring in this country, girls under 10, or not under 10, but 7 or 8, dying in much higher rates than boys because they were being deprived food, they were being deprived getting health care, till they were old enough to grab it for themselves. Women dying in childbirth because pregnancies were, just so many. You had the average family size at that point, 6.8. So from that vision where we were talking about doing things for women to pull them out of this situation, you now have feminism that only talks about sexuality. You have a very macho feminism coming up, which says, if you can do it, I can do it better. That's not my idea of feminism.
Okay.
We dreamt that we would bring the feminine perspective. That's what feminist was, humanist. To me, Gandhi was the greatest feminist of all. And it's that Gandhian perspective that we were talking about and saying, just as he brought the women out in their millions onto the roads and that they could walk. As they could walk around with their heads held high.
Right. So
we could do the same again with this. So, yes, and this, therefore, now goes back to basic issues.
Okay, good. So I think given the fact that you have this, your own experience with feminism, and there are other issues also that you will find in this book, which will make you sit up and think that everything we see as feminism today, you need to sometimes question, sometimes it's an individual perspective of it. And that is what this book does. And coming from you, especially, Ramiji, it's very important that we look at these things. I want to just slightly, because we are running out a bit of time now, so I think what I want to do is to take you to the Vajpayee years, where it was very interesting. This is a little away from the book, but it also talks about her innate Punjabiyat and what partition did to so many of us, where we always looked longingly with nostalgia onto the other side. And tell us how you were actually instrumental in that first bus going across the border, and that wonderful poem that you wrote.
Yes. Okay.
So this is very important.
Totally away from the book.
But we'll go back later in the questions.
Yes. But yes, and many times I sort of say I can't actually claim to have written that poem because when I first spoke it to my mother said, "Hey, kinni likhi hai tere vaste? Tanu to Punjabi aandi nahi." So, but I sat in front of the television, watched our soldiers being massacred as they climbed up that hilltop, and something brewed in me, and these words just came. And when I repeated them in the Indian International Center to friends, the women gathered around, and Vajpayee had just come back from that bus journey that he had taken, and they said, "Let's take a bus." Nirmala Deshpande, she was the one who led. She said, "Let's take a bus." And in fact, the poem was recited at Gandhi Smriti also on August 9th, and a lot of people came together at that time. And we said, "All right, we'll take a bus." And when I got down in Fletty Square, the Pakistanis asked me to repeat the poem.
Oh, how
so
lovely.
I said it there. I said it on Pakistani TV, and I will say it to you now. "Ae munde na tode na sade, sajde kafna te pe, ina da jawani da ishq, sade sanje vikas da lishq, jinu mata rahe a, luta rahe a, apne anmol khazaniyan nu vaga rahe a, ki mat mari todi vi te sadi vi, ke banjar pahadan te khad, ਅਸੀਂ ਖੰਡਰਾਂ ਨੂੰ ਖੰਡਾਰ ਰਹੇ ਹਾਂ ਤੇ ਉਹਨਾਂ ਅਨਮੋਲ ਖਜ਼ਾਨਿਆਂ ਨੂੰ ਲੁਟਾ ਰਹੇ ਹਾਂ ਜਿਹੜੇ ਲੁੱਟ ਗਏ ਤੇ ਵਾਪਸ ਆਣਗੇ ਨਾ ਕਦੀ, ਸਿਰਫ ਯਾਦਾਂ ਸਤਾਣਗੇ ਤਰਸੋ ਸਦੋ ਸਦੀ। ਕਾਸ਼ ਅਸੀਂ ਮਿਲ ਕੇ ਕੰਮ ਕਰੀਏ, ਚਰਖਾ ਚਾਂਦ ਵਿੱਚ ਡਿੱਗ ਪਰੀਏ, ਭੁੱਖ ਗਰੀਬੀ ਪਿਛੜਾਪਨ ਨੂੰ ਦੂਰ ਧਰੀਏ, ਅਸਲੀ ਚੁਣੌਤੀਆਂ ਦਾ ਸਾਹਮਣਾ ਸਾਂਝ ਕਰੀਏ। ਜੁੜੀ ਹੈ ਸਾਡੀ ਵਿਰਾਸਤ। There are other verses in between, but I'll shorten it. ਜੁੜੀ ਹੈ ਸਾਡੀ ਵਿਰਾਸਤ, ਜੁੜੀ ਹੈ ਸਾਡੀ ਤਕਦੀਰ। ਜਦ ਵੰਡਣ ਨੂੰ ਪਈ something thing, ਫਿਰ ਕਿਉਂ ਅਸੀਂ ਬਣਾਉਂਦੇ ਇੱਕ ਦੂਜੇ ਤਜੋਰੀ ਦਿੱਤੀ, ਕਿਉਂ ਅਸੀਂ ਬਣਾਉਂਦੇ ਇੱਕ ਦੂਜੇ ਨੂੰ ਫਕੀਰ, ਮਰੋੜ ਤਰੋੜ ਕੇ ਇੱਕ ਦੂਜੇ ਦੇ ਸਰੀਰ। ਅਸਮਾਨ ਹੈ ਸਾਡੀ ਸੱਚੀ ਸੀਮਾ, ਅਸਮਾਨ ਹੈ ਸਾਡੀ ਸਾਂਝੀ ਸੀਮਾ, ਜੇ ਅਸੀਂ ਮਿਲ ਕੇ ਕੰਮ ਕਰੀਏ, ਭੁੱਖ ਬਰੀ ਗਰੀਬੀ ਪਿਛੜਾਪਨ ਨੂੰ ਦੂਰ ਕਰੀਏ, ਅਸਲੀ ਚੁਣੌਤੀਆਂ ਦਾ ਸਾਹਮਣਾ ਸਾਂਝ ਕਰੀਏ। ਜਦ ਸਾਹਮਣੇ ਅਸਮਾਨ ਦੀ ਸੀਮਾ, ਫਿਰ ਲੀਕਾਂ ਤੇ ਕਿਉਂ ਮਰੀਏ, ਸਾਂਝ ਤੋਂ ਕਿਉਂ ਡਰੀਏ।
बहुत अच्छा, very nice. Okay, I think we have such a lovely, a poem which has been written by you. As you said, it came to you in a flash, but I think it is a very meaningful moment for us to turn to the audience. You've got a vast, a look at the vast repertoire of Ramiji's writing and all the work that she has done so far. So, any questions from the audience?
Actually, we have mics also to be handed around. So we can take 3 questions at a time. And that would be great if some of the men in the audience ask the first question.
Okay,
There's
here
a very
goes.
brave male here. You can identify yourself and ask the question.
First of all, applause to you, and congratulations and admiration for your work and your journey. And of course, me being a feminist as well, I've been involved with the feminist movement.
You have to speak a little louder. At 86, my major disability is my hearing now.
Maybe you could increase it a little bit. I could shout it out.
No, you can just put it a little louder.
I got to. Is that better? All right, thank you. Sensei Raj from Vision India 2032. And first of all, I'll start off with congratulating you and admiration and respect for your entire journey and what you stand for. And myself being a feminist as well, being involved with the feminist movement right in the US and in the UN as well. So I could relate, and I've seen people who have gone overboard and then also try to calibrate, bring it back to the middle way of what feminism actually stands for. Without men, there's no feminism as well. And I think that's where...
So what's the question?
I'll come to it. First of all, my comments.
Okay.
Right. My question to you is that, what is the message that you want the future of our country and also the entire humanity in the entire globe would want to learn from you, your journey, and what you stand for? Thank you.
He wants to know that what would you like to be your message? What do you want the world to learn from
From
you?
the book.
Let's take two more
I
questions.
urge you to read the book because the entire book.
Let's
it
take
has
two
a-
more questions, then you can answer.
I think
Okay.
Yeah.
Okay.
Any other questions anywhere?
there's one at the
There's-
back.
There's one at the back. I can't spot anyone. Well, let me then ask a question, if you permit.
I'm asking here.
Yeah, please go ahead.
Madam, you're, in this novel, the characters you have chosen, the name and the character, are they imaginary or the name you have put on your own or imaginary? On what basis you chose?
Was Indu imaginary? We'll take one more question.
No, sorry. The first one was message, and what is now?
Just like he's asking about
The characters.
character of Indu and the others.
Others,
Were they imaginary or not?
Yeah.
Based
We'll
on
take
real
one
life.
more question.
Yeah.
Maybe this time from a lady.
Ah.
2 gents, 1 lady, that's... If there's no one else, let me ask a question. I think it would be interesting to have your perspective on the issues which are facing the women of today, the new generation. Because many are under the erroneous impression that they are living in an era of equality. But since I mentor, as I said, young women diplomats, I always tell them, and you said the same thing, that being emancipated doesn't mean that you should neglect your own safety. So for instance, if you're going into a country which is highly conservative and where if you dress in a particular manner you may be taken to be a prostitute, my advice is always just dress safely. It doesn't mean you're giving up anything. That's my perspective for the modern women of today, because in our time we learnt the hard way that to be liberated, to be emancipated, you need the support of men, emancipated men on one hand, and on the other, you need to be realistic, which is what I told my French colleague when I was ambassador to Netherlands, and she was going as an ICC team to Libya to negotiate the release of Gaddafi's son. And I told her, don't wear a skirt. But she went wearing a skirt with a Russian as her companion, the former Russian ambassador. The first thing that the Libyans did was to call her a spy, lock her up, and say that, pronounce the death penalty on her. But for the fact that the former Russian ambassador, Alexandre, refused to leave her and said, then you have to execute me too. And because of the pressure that President Putin put, they were both released. I was there at the airport when they both came back. And I told that lady, I said, next time, remember, when you go into lion's territory, don't put your head into the lion's mouth. Be practical, because that is also part of being liberated. I'd like your comments on that.
Yeah.
Thank you.
Wise words, Bhaswati.
Yeah,
and
very
I
wise.
would endorse them completely, because that's what I say too, that it's, you have to be circumspect. You have to, you're welcome to wear your bikini on the beach, but you don't wear a bikini into the market square. So it's as simple as that. You have to, you assert your right to do what you want to do, but you must watch the context in which you are moving and functioning. So I'm solidly with you on that. I think in terms of your saying that and I'm starting with the last question first, and I'll come back to the others, that we are in an era of equality. I would say yes and no. Era of equality for people like us. In fact, I would say here we have too much entitlement, in fact. You have now young women not willing to adjust in any way. And that's the other extreme. And fortunately, by now we have raised enough sons, also a generation that looked at feminism, and men who are willing to participate much more in partnerships. So there is, in that level, equality, which can be construed differently by the two sexes. But for the large masses, I'm sorry to say we haven't got there yet. And that's why I say that the issues that I raise here of early marriage, of our dowry, are very, very relevant. I want to spend a minute or two just to tell you that this is a report from Times of India, 2nd January 25. National Commission of Women, dowry, torture, domestic violence remains serious worry, NCW data. And they point out that a third of all the crimes against women are domestic violence. And within domestic violence, dowry is another third. So, I mean, you know, nothing. And when this book was launched at the IHC, I had brought out another report, which had come out in the Economic Times, which said that marriages were now, weddings were now, the second biggest industry in the country after grocery. And only, I think it was this morning's paper, or yesterday's paper, where I saw something, where there was a column which pointed out that while the per capita income is around ₹1 lakh, oh yes, it was a column that talked about the simpler wedding that is going to take place with the Adanis, in contrast to what happened with the Ambanis, okay? And so somebody was being lauded for having only had 300 people, only 300.
He donated some extra
Money too, yes.
But it goes on to say that the per capita income is $1 lakh, and the average expenditure by the average man, not the Ambani, not the Adani, not even the minor Ambanis, Adanis, but just the average person, is 15. So you spend 1 lakh a year, not 1 lakh a month, 150. So the average person spends 15 years of their earnings on weddings even now. So these are very basic issues that we need to go back and examine again, and we need to confront our leaders today who are now sort of saying that, you know, have weddings in India. Have weddings in India rather than elsewhere, but they're not talking about expenditures. Message of the book, I would urge you to read the book. And the message of the book is Indu fights, and that goes into the character of Indu too, which is the second question. Indu fights for her dignity. Indu fights for her rights, but she never forgets her responsibilities. She never forgets to exert compassion in whatever happens. And I think that's the message that I want to put out, that women have to be, feminists have to be different. We are humanists. We want our dignity. We will not compromise on that, but we will do it in dignified ways.
And compassionately. Yeah, that's a good point.
We'll take one last
think,
question.
Yes, all right.
I just wanted to add to what Rami ji said, that there is a lady called Radhika Kumaraswamy, who is UN Special Rapporteur on Violence Against Women. And when she brought out her report to the Human Rights Commission, I was very surprised to see that the country which is at #1 position for domestic violence against women is Canada.
Canada, I would have thought America.
And it remains in the #1 position till today. That is to say that whatever we are much better off than many countries in the West, where violence against women and also, unfortunately, incest is very, very high. It's very high in Netherlands, it's very high in Belgium. Belgium has the highest rate of incest in the world, and Canada continues in the glorious position for the last 35 years to be number one in the position of domestic violence against women. So when they come to sermonize you, just remember that. We'll take one last question from here.
Yeah, I was very happy you mentioned that, Bhaswati ji, about that thing on Libya, and the lady was wearing this coat. Now, I go back to what German Greer in the 70s and 80s, in her book, The Second Sex, she was telling women that's how feminism came here in India. She said, burn your bras, don't be just free, wear whatever you want. Then suddenly she realized that's not the right thing to do. She changed her opinion, went volte-face, and she said, no, it's the mind that you have to be strong, not your smoking and drinking is not going to make you equal to men by burning your bras. So change the other way, become more feminine, but more masculine in your mind. And so she changed her whole entire thing totally.
Actually, I'm so glad you mentioned it, because when I mentor young women diplomats, I also tell them that don't think that you can show your equality by taking more black label than your male colleagues, because it is medically established that the bigger you are, the stronger you are, the fatter you are, you can absorb more alcohol, and you also need to be habituated to alcohol. So please don't think that if your male colleague has taken 4 large black labels, you should do the same. Not at all, because then you will become drunk and make a fool of yourself. So this is a very important issue that you raised, that to be feminist, you have to be sure that you are feminist in the correct way. You don't give an opportunity to those who are against feminism to hold you up as an example of what a woman should not be. I'll give the floor back to...
Now I think we need to sort of remember while we are here, which is to celebrate this wonderful book written by the feminist, I can still say that, Rami Chhabra, because she has tried to bring out all these nuances which we were talking about today in her wonderful book. Please do buy a copy. Please do read this book, and it's outside for you to collect. Yeah. She can sign a few copies for you also. Thank you very much for being here with us today, and for the wonderful Rami.
Thank you.